Lisa Taylor, welcome back to the Rocky Mountain Writer podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, just had you on recently as fellow co-editor of the Four Corners Voices from Four Corners Writers down here in Southwest Colorado. But now we've got even bigger news, at least in the world of Lisa Taylor, which is the release yesterday. We're talking on Wednesday, the 19th, the release yesterday of your brand new first debut novel.
Yes. Yeah, The Shape of What Remains just released.
Yeah. How does it feel after all this time? I know you've got short story collections out there, poetry collections out there, and I guess basically you just want to take over the world.
Yeah, I think that's it. One book at a time, take over the world. I mean, you know, I don't want to be a politician, so writing's what I do.
That's great. Well, tell us what we're going to talk a lot about, the shape of what remains, but tell us, this has been in the works for a while, has it not?
Yeah, this book started as a short story, and it's a short story called Monuments, and it's in my first short story collection called Growing a New Tale. When I wrote the short story, I absolutely knew it was meant to be a novel. But at that time, in 2015, I was working full time teaching creative writing at night. I did not have the time to write a novel. So I sort of tabled it and kept it in my head, and went back to it. And so it literally took about 8 years to finish it, but I wasn't working on it entirely. I actually had another poetry collection. I had another collection of short stories. I've been in a bunch of anthologies since then. In fact, I have a new anthology piece coming out in a couple of weeks, I think. So I was busy doing other things, and I co-direct the Mesa Verde Writers Conference, so I do that as well and teach online. So I didn't work on it constantly, but I worked on it a lot. And I started sending it out about 2.5 years ago and got two offers and took one of them.
Yeah. What was it about this particular idea you think that just stayed active, stayed alive in your imagination?
Well, it's a really weird thing to say, but I'm glad you asked because, people characterize writers as plotters or pantsers. And pantsers, I'm guessing, is by the seat of your pants.
Yep.
I'm absolutely, undoubtedly a pantser.
Me
Um,
too.
yeah, so what happens is the character comes to me, and she was in my head after I wrote Monuments. Tess just would not get out of my head. She was there all the time, nagging me, saying, I got a bigger story here. Are you gonna write it or what? And I just couldn't shake her. And she stayed in my head, she developed, as characters do. So I got to know a whole lot about her. What's her favorite food? What colors does she like? What kinds of things really annoy her? All the things that we really do come to know about our characters, even if those things don't end up in the book, we kind of have to know them. And I feel like, she became like my twin. She was in my head. And so I had to get her out of my head. So I had to write the book. That's kind of what happened. And as I wrote it, it went through probably 20 some odd revisions. I mean, it's been a long process. 3 years into writing it, my next door neighbor's daughter was diagnosed with neuroblastoma, and she was exactly the same age as the young daughter who dies. And I'd done all this research, so I was able to help Mia find some resources after her daughter died. So it's just kind of the personal side of the story, and I did put a dedication to her in there, is that we sort of watched the grieving process as it was playing out with our next door neighbor. And as and tried to support as best we could, which is what I got was that there's really no good way to do it. I mean, there's no good way to handle catastrophic events like this. There just isn't. None of us as humans are good at the grieving process. It's not something we ever learn. And that's what I was trying to get across, is that there's no timetable, there's no right way to grieve. You're not doing it wrong if 10 years later you're still absolutely in depression. There's just no right way to do it. That every stage of grief has its own timetable and it's different for every person. And I think if that's the biggest lesson I think that will come from this book.
Yeah. When it comes to grief, I often think it's sort of some sort of human miracle that we actually get up the next day after experiencing somebody passing away, dying tragically, dying from a disease or some fluke accident or something. It's a miracle that we can actually function at all the next day, or even in a grief state. The fact that we are able over a few weeks, a few months, of maybe a few years, to begin to just get back to doing our thing. And like you say, it could be 10 years, but where in our you're right. There's no classes, there's no lesson, there's no menu, there's no recipe to follow to get back to an even keel.
Absolutely not. There is a group called Compassionate Friends, which I discovered as I was researching, and I directed my neighbor to, which exists wholly to support parents who have lost children. And that can run the gamut from having a stillbirth or even a miscarriage all the way to a live child of any age that dies. And as you know, I have had people kind of come out of the woodwork and say, yeah, I lost my adult child, and maybe to an overdose or something. And this book really spoke to me. So I'm really glad that it's reaching people that aren't just people who have lost children in a freak accident like it happens in this book, which, by the way, is not a spoiler because the book opens 10
Right.
years after that event. So that is very clear immediately. It really isn't about that event. It's
Hmm.
about Teresa and her process and how she's going to get through this.
Yeah. What did you think that you could bring to this topic, which, I mean, I think you could, in a lot of ways, you could argue almost every novel is a love story in some ways. Almost every novel is a story about loss in some ways. What did you think you could bring to this? And was it daunting at first, or are you the kind of writer who just says, "I'm just going to go for it. Doesn't matter if it's been covered by other novelists, 100,000 times. I need to bring my own voice to this topic."
It's many things. And one thing that came up curiously for me that I honestly didn't expect to come up, and that most people don't know about me, is that I actually had an 18-year career as a counselor therapist. And at one point worked in a school where a lot of children had lost parents, and we spontaneously started a grieving group. And I paired with a social worker from outside the school who was kind of an expert in grieving. And I hadn't thought about that in years. And that social worker just is deceased a long time ago. And I really hadn't thought about Mary and the wisdom that she brought to the group and what I learned from the group and how it changed my life as a counselor therapist. And it came back when I started writing. I remembered things. So when I wrote some of the therapy scenes, I really did was calling up some of that knowledge that I had from graduate school and from practicums and from my own experience. And I guess things just don't go away. I had really never gone back to that. I haven't done that in a very long time, but it was very helpful in writing this book to feel like I, not that I understand what it's like to lose a child because it's not my story, but I understand how personal grieving is and how individual it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you go back to the short story and use anything, or did you just start fresh?
I used pretty much the entirety of one of the
Okay.
not the whole short story. I used a lot of the short story though, because that particular segment I liked very much. I did change a couple of parts of it. So I had permission from Arlen House Syracuse University Press to quote liberally use as much of it as I wanted, and I did. Because I liked it. I mean, I think it worked, and I changed the order of things, but it was the thing that first got me thinking about it, and I still think it holds.
Yeah. What were the biggest challenges for you? Somebody who's published dozens and dozens of short stories and I don't know, a couple hundred poems, probably more than that. What were the biggest challenges going to the long form novel?
Well, I can say this to you because you're a novelist too. It was having that many balls in the air. When you write a short
Mhm.
story, it's like a little epiphany. I sort of get the idea. I hold the idea in my head and I draw it to some sort of a conclusion that doesn't have to be that neat. It can be sort of open-ended sometimes, but it isn't a whole bunch of balls in the air. You have to have a lot of character development in a novel. So I really had to get to know her. I had to know, how she was going to react. I think the thing that helped me the most was her voice was so strong right from the get-go, and she's snarky. She's, she's a bit of a pain. She's, kind of humorous and snarky and self-deprecating, and a lot of things that I recognize in people and sometimes really like in other people. So I liked her as a character, even though she could be incredibly difficult. I really like that she's so fiercely intelligent and stands up for herself, even not entirely. I mean, I just had a reader who wrote to me and said, I really wanted her to stand up for herself more in, I don't want to give anything away, in blah 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 chapter. And I get it. And I felt like I couldn't totally control that. It's sometimes it's weird to think that we're actually creating these things, but we don't have total control because the character does what she wants to do. And even if you know she's going to self-destruct from doing it, I had to let her do it. So she, she makes a lot of mistakes, as as do we all the time. I mean, how many times the humans say, "Wow, I wish I hadn't done that or said that." We do that all the time. We're imperfect. So she's a very imperfect character, as is her husband. So, it's kind of a novel about coming to terms with that too.
Yeah. Yep. I read a draft very close to publication. I don't think it was the absolute final draft after all the edits, but I definitely enjoyed what I think to your point, you're handed a novel about death and grief and a loss of a child at a tragic age, and you start reading and realize that you're in for a mood. The mood doesn't necessarily match the topic, which I think is really a smart thing to do to bring in. I mean, she's got a world view, and I think that that's what gives the novel some real edge to it and a definition, a sharp definition. It's not just endless processing. She already knows a lot about who she is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, she's kind of a self-actualized human. She was a full professor. She was actually, tenure track professor, but the depression made her lose her job. She teaches just one class at the beginning of the novel because she's not very functional. But she still hasn't lost a bit of her intelligence or a bit of her wit. I mean, she's really kind of sarcastic and, cynical, and a lot of things, but some of them I think are kind of entertaining too. Like when she, snipes at her husband, you get it. I mean, he kind of deserves it at different points. And she,
Yeah.
she takes no prisoners. She's out there, and
Yeah.
I like her. I created her, but I also like her. I was
Yeah.
kind of rooting for her. And honestly, it's the Panther thing, but I really did not know how this novel would end when I wrote it. And I just had a reader write to me and say, well, I wish blah, blah, blah had happened at the end. And I said, well, I kind of do too, but it couldn't. I didn't have
Yeah.
the ultimate control, which sounds weird, but I know you probably know what I'm talking about. I just
I
didn't.
do.
So I had to let her do what she did, whether every reader agrees with it or not. It was the logical place for it to go. So, and I won't give any spoilers, except that it's a surprise. You have to read it.
Yeah. For those who don't, for those who outline or for those who don't do the seat of the pants approach, talk a little bit about how you approach each writing session or day. Um, how do you know where you're going to go plot wise? You've got to have some action. You've got to have a turning point. You can't just be an endless static description of her existence. Things have to change in her world one way or another.
Right.
How do you develop the plot points based on what's happening in the moment of your writing?
Well, I do it kind of organically, but I did jot down bunches of things. Like I know, and every writer knows that fiction is driven by conflict. So you have to have conflicts, and they can be little conflicts. You're not going to have catastrophic things throughout a novel because you'd lose interest pretty quickly. So I did jot down things. If that was a conflict, was there any kind of resolution to that conflict? Where did it go? So I took notes. I don't do outlines, but I take notes. And I had to too because if I'm writing in the morning, picking it up the next day, or maybe I'm going away because I have an appointment the next morning, picking it up 2 days later, I'm not going to remember everything. I wish I could, but I don't always. So I have to jot down some notes of where I left off so I can pick it up at a logical place. So that's the most I do. And even then, I do throw some of those out because I think, oh, that's just too neat. I don't want it to be that neat. I want it to be a little messier. So, and really to me, when you're writing a draft, just let it go. I don't think that drafts are a place for editing. I think that we as writers have to just let our imagination take hold, write it. It could be really lousy, but write it all the way through and then go back and look at it. And so I did see, well, that doesn't really work. I had one part and when I was working with a copy editor, she said, you have this whole part where you're in her head for like 3 pages. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. I mean, I can do that because I know what she's doing, but you as the reader don't know what she's doing. So I changed that. That was really good feedback. And that's why getting beta readers is so useful. And also working with an editor is really useful. But I do take notes. I do jot down. I have little stickies all over my office right now because I'm working on and trying to sell another novel, a very different novel. So I have to do that or I can't keep track of everything. But I don't do it. I don't say, oh, there's an arc. Okay, well, then I need to do this. I never do that. I just do it
Mhm.
organically and then I go back and fix it if it's not working. I don't
Yeah.
if that's crazy or makes sense, but it is my process.
I'm curious, given all the poetry you've written and all the poetry you've taught, and just you really have lived in a world of poetry for a long, long time, in addition to short stories, of course. But as you're writing a full-length novel or a short story, is there a part of you that kind of has that poetry brain that you turn off and on and say, I'm going to slide in a little something here that's different? To me, poetry just has that different way of putting words together, of course. But are you just, I need a little poetic dab of splash of color right here.
I really think so. I think being a poet by training, and I've been writing poetry since literally I was 12 years old. It's been a big part of my life. And it makes me think lyrically. So when I use a lot of images, and I do use a lot of images in here, in fact, a couple of the people who wrote me blurbs noticed that and said that it's very very lyrical, very the poetic language is there. It's not all over the place. It's not flowery or anything, but I think it's just that acute observation that poets have and a way of not putting words in like subject, object, verb structure, which gets boring really fast to read. And I mean, as any writer of a novel, that if you describe something using images, people are going to form a picture in their brain and it's going to stay with them a lot longer. So I think that training has been really helpful. And I have to say that I'm really sold on novels now. I'm very much enjoying this. And I have a friend who's also made the transition from being a poet to being a novelist, and it's really captured me quite a bit. Although I do occasionally write a poem, and I just had a poem published, and I will have another poem coming out in this anthology in Ireland. So it's not like that world is completely abandoned, but I really do love fiction. I've always loved reading novels. I've been an avid reader of novels forever. So I just thought, oh, well, it's something that I love and it entertains me, but I can't write that. And now I think, well, yeah, I can because I did. So
Mhm.
never say never, right?
Right, right. What would you say as, and maybe this is tapping into your therapist training and that therapist brain, what would you say to somebody who's struggling to write and be creative in these, I would say turbulent, you could say tragic, you could say treacherous times? How how do you approach it? Are you able to put aside what's happening out there in terms of turmoil and focus on creativity? Is it something that you just have to do because it's who you are? And I guess back to my other sort of question is what would you say to somebody who's struggling to create?
Well, I used to say this to my students a lot. I taught creative writing for many, many years. And I said, write a rant. If you're getting up in the morning at whatever time you get up, and you're really feeling like I'm just really upset by world news or personal news or whatever, write a rant. Just bitch on the page for as long as you need to do. Get it out. But that don't call that your writing of the day. Call that your rant of the day. But you do need to move that out of the way sometimes because it gets in the way. So I do that sometimes. Sometimes I just take a moment, I meditate, I try to get myself calm. I try not to read the news when I'm writing because that is always going to infiltrate and make it really difficult. I don't always keep that rule because all my rules get broken. I'm not a really good rule keeper, so I try. But I do think that writing a rant and getting it out is not a bad thing. And even if you don't want to do that on paper, talk to somebody or do whatever you need to do to get that out of the way and then write. Writing is a good escape. I don't think it really creeps into my writing very often. It's not that I haven't written, my new book that I'm trying to sell definitely has political issues in it, much more than this one. Although this one doesn't shy away. There are some things. But the new one is definitely would be more controversial in that way. So it's not like it doesn't impact my life as a writer. It's just that it doesn't take over my life as a writer. I think the biggest issue with writing, and I know you know this, is you just got to do it. You got to put your butt in the chair and you got to just write. And a lot of what you write is going to be garbage because that's just how it goes. So maybe it's a
Yeah.
rant, maybe it's a warm up, maybe it's just really trite and bad writing. But then you get it out of the way and the better stuff comes. And I think those of us who've been writing a long time, we trust that process and we know that we'll get to the good stuff if we hang in there. I I fervently believe that because it's always worked. I mean, I write a lot of short stories and I have some I will never ever use because I just don't think they're fully realized and I don't feel like I can fix them or I want to put the time into fixing them. So, that's how it goes. Not everything
Yeah.
is a work of art. It's
Yeah. Coming back to Shape of What Remains, tell us about that title. Where did that come from?
it's really weird. And nobody's asked me this before, and I've told nobody this, and now it's going to be all over the place. Anyway, it came from a poem, but I got to tell you that the poem is about something very, very, very different. It's actually about a one night stand. So
One of your poems?
yeah, it's one of my poems in one of my collections, and I just always liked the title, and I don't think it really fits the poem. And it's my title. I get to do what I want.
Sure,
And
sure.
I always liked that title, and it so fits this. And Monuments was like, that wasn't it. That just was
Yeah.
okay for the short story, but it doesn't really call up what this calls up because it really is about what remains, what it looks like, this kind of um, ephemeral thing that is left when the person is gone. In Teresa's life, it may be physical things like, her stuffed animal or something, but ultimately, when that's all gone, it becomes this shape, this ephemeral thing that will always live inside her. Even if she gets to a better place, it will always be there. So it just felt absolutely like the right title. So what I did was I stole a title for myself.
I think that's 100% allowed.
Legal.
And yeah, yeah. Go back to the scrap heap of your stuff and
Mhm.
pluck out good things. So the title kind of stayed with you just like the short story stayed with you from the
It
get-go.
really did. It really
Yeah.
did. And the second book I'm working on is actually also a short story and also in that same short story collection. And I also knew it was going to be a novel.
Mhm.
So, and
Yeah.
no other short stories in the two collections I have spoke to me in that way that they felt like much longer stories, but those two really did.
Yeah. Well, just looking at what you're planning ahead this spring, I'm really impressed by the lengths you're going to go to get out on the road and market this book. You've got some plans.
I got some plans. I really like doing events, so
Yeah.
that's in my favor that I enjoy engaging with audiences and that I was a professor for a long time and I taught in an arts high school and I like engaging with audiences. So I don't have anything about that. It's just the planning and, I wish I had, like rock bands have. I wish I had a manager that just set everything up and said, okay,
Yeah.
up here. It doesn't work like that with
Yeah.
writers. And so it's a lot of work
Hmm.
and I will be on the road mid-April to probably the end of May.
Yep.
Uh, and I have
Back
events.
east, back east,
Yeah, I have events
New
across the
Mexico.
country. Yeah, I'll have some events on the way, and I may have some events in Ireland. That is a work in progress right now because my Irish publisher and people I know in Ireland would like me to do something there. So, and I would like to do something there. And honestly, it's just a really good excuse to go there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I must feel pretty amazing to have this out in the world and to have climbed that mountain of getting your first novel out.
It does. It's a bit surreal, and as it probably was for you when you had your first novel. There's something a little weird about being so public because even though I have short stories and poetry, I mean, poetry's not very public. It's a very small readership, and it always will be. I had dedicated readers, but it's a small readership. There are lots of people that never read poetry and never will. So I don't understand it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
their loss.
Yep. Very good. Well, this has been a great rundown of your current world and what's happening. So thanks very much. We always like to kind of wrap up the conversation with a um, suggestion of a book or an author that you think more folks should be reading.
Yeah, well, I just I before we started the interview, I said that I am Reading the Waves by Lydia Yuknavitch, and her last name is spelled just as you would expect. Yuknavich. Anyway, Lidia. I have been really taken with her first memoir, which was The Chronology of Water. This is also a memoir, but like everything Lydia does, it's completely unconventional and interspersed with all sorts of things. It's hooked me. It really is hooked me really early on. I read a lot, so I would also recommend, but everybody else recommends James by Percival Everett, which I thought was one of my best reads of the year. But Lydia's new memoir is really worth reading. It's a bit
I,
harrowing, but it's worth it.
yeah, I am three-quarters of the way through James. Absolutely amazing. So clean. His style of writing in this book is just so clean and light. It's not a heavy read at all, but it's absolutely fascinating.
It
Re
really is. And
Yeah,
there's some certain genius things that we won't tell because they're spoilers. But I
right.
gotta say, it's one of the best endings I've ever read in a novel.
Mm,
And I go back to it in my head a lot and saying, I want to not end a novel with that resonant an ending, that something that will always stay with
mm,
me. It's such a good ending. And the
yeah,
endings are hard. They really
yeah,
are.
yeah. And I guess I've got to go back to the memoir stuff and what makes it harrowing because to me that is the challenge of a good memoir is to go beyond the surface and dig into something that's personal, maybe a little scary, maybe almost a little transgressive, where you think you're going outside the bounds of a civilized conversation into, you're outside polite society and beyond just recounting what you did in your life, but you're really into the interiority.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
she's really good at that. And one of the things about Lydia Yuknavitch that's unique is that she was a competitive swimmer. And her swimming plays, again, it figures very highly in all of her books because it's kind of the thing that kept her together. And, she's like a little bit part fish. So she goes back to that again and again when she has, trauma that she talks about. And she has trauma, plenty of trauma. I think that that's the connective tissue is her relationship to water. And, the first book, Chronology of Water, this one is Reading the Waves. And again, it just keeps coming back. And I get that because I'm very much a water person. And that's why I live in the mountains.
Yeah. 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 Well, fantastic, Lisa. Congratulations again. And when novel number two comes out, we'll have you back on.
Yeah, well, thank you. I like that positive thinking. Thanks a lot for having me.